Today we are going to look at measures of center, and this includes three different things. It includes mode, median, and mean. And all three of these, although they are different, they kind of help us to determine this idea of typical. What is typical for a set of data? And all three are different. And we actually explored these in several different investigations, but I'm kind of combining them into one video because they tend to go together. So let's take some data, for example. All right, we're going to look at a set of data that you see here, and we're going to pretend that these are all test scores. And this is, let's pretend it's a math class, and this is one student, and here are all of this student's test scores. And to just make it easy, I did make them all multiples of 10. In order to find your measures of center, you don't have to set up a line plot, but I'm going to, just because I'm going to show you how you can use a line plot to get your measures of center kind of easily, and this will help us also review that. Remember, a line plot is simply a nice x-axis, which I would use a ruler for. I would put a label on, which in this case, all of this data represents my test scores. I would have some sort of title on there, so let's say it was Mr. Potato Head is taking this class, so it's Mr. Potato Head's math scores, how he did. Okay, I also need a scale on that x-axis, so since these are all multiples of 10, I can really make my scale go by tens. So you could get a 10%, a 20%, and so on. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put on my plots. So I see that Mr. Potato Head got an 80%, he got a 90%, he got a 70%. Then he got another 90, and then he got a 100, then he got a 40, ooh boy. Then he got another 100, and then he got another 90. Now, if we just think back to the last video just for a nice recap, I can really look at the shape of my data really easily. And remember, that's things like clusters and gaps. And what I'm noticing, just looking at my data values or my line plot, is there's a nice cluster right here. That's telling me that Mr. Potato Head, I think, generally gets between 70 and 100, but even more so, I see a cluster right here where I'm circling in red. So he tends to be a high scoring student, but then I see this gap over here. And the gap is falling right in this zone that I'm showing you right now because he did get a 40%. And remember, that 40% is really what we call an outlier. It's a piece of data that's sort of an oddball. It doesn't fit the rest. It doesn't have to always be bad. It can be a good outlier, but it means it's not quite like the others. Okay, so therefore we're going to look at our measures of center. Well, the first one we're going to talk about is mode. Mode is often the easiest one to find because mode just means most often. It's the data value we see the most. You can find it by looking at your data set up here in your list, but when you have a line plot, it's really easy to find. So I'm noticing that my mode is my 90%. Mr. Potato Head has gotten a 90% for most tests. Okay, great. So that could be sort of maybe showing us what's typical. And we'll talk about how you have to, what do you really use for typical? Even though all three measures of center kind of help us, there's some that are better than others. The next one we're going to work on is median. Remember, with median, we have to order our data first from least to greatest. And I can do that just using, again, my data values up here. But what I like on a line plot is it kind of does it for me. I see I have a 40, I have a 70, I have an 80, then I have three 90s in a row. So that's nice, and I also have two 100s in a row. And so now to find the middle value is you literally are finding the middle. I'm noticing that there's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's 8 data values, 8 test scores that were given. So if I were to go into the middle, it would be between this 4th and 5th. Now because I'm between two 90s, the median becomes 90%. If we don't know what it is, we would have to average those two middles. If you have an odd number of pieces of data, you can actually literally just find the middle, which is nice, one midpoint score. But in this case, we're looking for this place right between the two 90s. So he has a 90% again. If you notice, it's happening to work out the same as the mode. Sometimes that happens. Not always. Now I will say typically your median and your mode should be somewhat close though. There's always exceptions, but I would doubt that you would have a median, let's say, of a 90% and a mode of 40%. But you never know, it could happen. And so the last one we're going to go over is this idea of mean. All right, And so let's look at that. Okay, remember, another word for mean is average. And this was the investigation where we were evening out. We were actually getting stacks of cubes and we were evening them out. And although that was a great strategy, in real life it doesn't always really work too well. So what we found out after doing a lot of investigations is that there was kind of a nice, easy way to average. And what you do is the first thing you're going to do is you add up your scores, or your data values, whatever it happens to be. So if I go ahead and I add these up, I have a 40 plus a 70 plus an 80, I have 3 90s, and then I have 2 hundreds. So I'm coming up with a total of 660 points that he's earned. And then you can divide by the number of data values. So in this case, I think we already realized that it's 8. So I'm going to take that 660 and divide it by 8. And that should give me my evening out. And it's telling me that Mr. Potato Head has an 82.5%, which is about an 83. Now, if you notice, this is very, very different than that mode and that median. So we said measures of center tend to show you what's typical. But as we've had conversations, we said that some are better than others. The problem with the mean, the reason that his score, his overall average is coming down, is because of that outlier over here. That 40% really hurt him. Whereas normally he was in the 90s, 100s, that's where we saw the cluster, that's where we saw the mode, the median even came out to be a 90. That 40% really brought his average down, which is not great. However, I wouldn't say that the 40% is typical of what Mr. Potato Head does. So that's why we said that although we use averaging in schools, it might not be the best measure of center to really show what's typical about you. Because if we changed this and we decided to say, you know what, that's not typical of him, let's take that 40% out. I wish I had a little more space here, but I don't. If we took that 40% out, it would be like taking that 660 points, taking out that 40%, which would give me 620. And now, because that 40% is gone, instead of 8 scores, we actually have gone down to 7. So if I divide that 620 by 7, he actually ends up with an 89%, which is really close to that 90% that we said was the mode and the median. And so now it looks like this is a little bit more representative of what Mr. Potato Head is. Instead of an 83, he's an 89. And again, what's bringing it down slightly is that 70% now. So you can see how the mean is easily affected by outliers. So there is just our video on measures of center. It's mode, median, and mean. And even though we looked at those in different investigations, there's 3 things that kind of show us, again, what's typical. However, we've found out that oftentimes median is the more reliable of the measures of center and is often very similar to mode. And sometimes mean is really on there. If you're a consistent person, let's say as a student, you're going to have consistent scores. But if you have one outlier, whether it's good or bad, it can really affect that overall average. Okay? All right, well, go ahead and try these and see how you do.